Hi there, Roger Connect, President of Universal Accounting Center, and I'm here today with Brad Fisher from Featherstone Holdings, and you happen to be the president and owner of a company that does an amazing work with other family businesses. So this is going to be a wonderful discussion.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so what I've done is I've invited Brad to come speak because I believe a lot of us not only have family-run businesses where many of us have our employees as maybe sons or daughters, brothers or sisters, but so many of the clients that we work with are in fact family-run businesses. And so I think a lot of the points that you're going to be sharing today are very, very practical to what it is they experience.
That's right.
Yeah, so why don't we go and jump into this and see what it is that you have to share today.
Well, thank you. We're going to talk today about the concept, as you can see on the screen, of family business abundance. Just talk through some of the difficulties and some of the benefits of family businesses, and then really take a deeper dive on how to scale those family businesses.
Now, your history, your background's quite fascinating. I mean, you've worked with some astounding families and some large businesses.
Thank you.
Why don't you share with everyone a little bit of that?
Sure. Well, I guess the best way to describe my career so far is that I spent the first 25 years of my career as an entrepreneur, startup company CEO, built businesses, sold some of them, and then ended up being recruited by one of my investors to help him with his what's called family office, which is the family wealth management, financial management, and strategic management for large multi-generational families. And I spent about 15 years working with major families, the names of whom you'd recognize, and just learned so much. And it enabled me to bring together two sides of the family business challenge: the family relationships and clarity, and the scalability and organization of their companies.
Now, what I think you and I would agree to, and everyone else may have experienced, is a lot of times these businesses, when they grow as large as they do and they get multi-generational, is they do start to bring a lot of these tried and proven techniques and strategies into the family dynamic, and they start to run the family with similar type business principles, with mission statements and purposes and so forth. So that's always quite, I think, telling as to how they take those tried and proven elements of a successful business and they incorporate it into their family structure.
That's right. And the two are intimately intertwined, as you'll see when we go through our presentation here. Absolutely. And even family businesses and families that are maybe not as multi-generational, not as large, can benefit from some of those techniques that these larger families do.
Well, we can always be better parents, right?
That's true. So the first thing to say is that really the family business path can be one of the most rich and rewarding journeys that a family can take. And I've worked with families that have been in business together for over 100 years, 3, 4, 5. In fact, one of my clients was 5th, 6th, 7th generation. They started in the mid-1800s. And that unity and that work and that legacy is so precious. Some families don't care, others do. So that's really why a lot of families stay in business. And, it's tough too.
Yep.
There are some major challenges and questions that these families
I can share with that Universal Accounting Center is actually entering its 40th year. We started in 1979. I'm the third president of the company. It's very much a family business but I'm not a family member, interestingly enough. And so that's kind of a unique dynamic. So seeing what happens in a family-run business, especially as an outsider, as I once was, coming into the company as an employee, growing through the ranks, it's definitely an interesting experience. And coincidentally, we just had the founder, him and his wife, they founded the company in '79, and they each passed away in the past year. And so that's caused kind of an interesting evolution as to how the family dynamics going to adapt to that situation with the family business.
Yeah, we wrestle with issues like that all the time.
Yeah.
In fact, some of the questions that we get asked is, how do families make decisions? And how do they get more control? And sometimes they want to pull control back from the patriarch or matriarch of the firm. They want to be more entrepreneurial. A lot of times families will sell their business and then they'll start another one or start a series or acquire companies. They want to grow like any other business. Sometimes this generational transition, you just spoke of a sad version of that, but a well-run family business will plan ahead for transitions from one generation to another. And we work a lot with what's called next gen, the next generation, to help them launch new businesses. And really, it's about relationships. It's about helping those generations get together. And it's about helping these families get unstuck. Family businesses are characterized by that word, stuck. And I know we've all been stuck before in our lives in various ways. Every business gets stuck, but families get even more so, because you can leave a company, but you can't leave your family. And so they have the family legacy, the family relationships, the family reputation to consider. And so there's just a lot more complexity. Mm-hmm. I like this picture because it reminds me, I grew up in North Dakota when I was 5 years old. That happened to me on our front porch railing. So every time I see that, I cringe. But, sometimes the companies get stuck. It's a business thing. It's the ability to adapt fast enough. Sometimes management gets stuck. And sometimes it's the family members who get stuck. They feel like they're trapped in a box or a bottle. And sometimes it's all three at once. And that's where we come in. And we'll talk about the idea of getting unstuck.
Well, one of the things that I can definitely relate to is in a family business, it's interesting. You'll take the loyalty that the family members have and you try to put it to work because they are committed, but there's a lack of skill sometimes. It's not necessarily that they're doing the right job or the best job, because that's not their proficiency. And so families do kind of experience this. And I've seen where some of the family members are imposed as if, well, this is what you're supposed to do. And yet they feel confined by that. They want that autonomy to go elsewhere and leave and go find themselves outside of the family business, right? So definitely these dynamics that you're expressing are very true.
There's a phrase in the family business world called separate but connected. And there's a balance. You try to keep the family together, but you have to always keep in mind that these are individuals. There has to be a way for people to leave the family enterprise, mm-hmm. maybe to come back to the family enterprise. Mm-hmm. And there also has to be very strong clarity around roles and responsibilities and capacities. And a lot of families do let themselves get trapped by bringing family members into inappropriate roles. We spend a lot of time working with families through that problem.
Yeah, very good.
Mm-hmm. So how do we get unstuck? Well, there's really this concept of family business abundance versus family business scarcity. I've worked over the years with so many families, some of whom have hundreds of millions of dollars. And I've known families with $500 million or more who feel broke. They have a feeling of scarcity because of the culture of the family, because maybe they sold their business years ago and they're just living off of investment portfolios. It sounds absurd to feel broke when you have $500 million, but it's true because of the mentality and the psychology. But on the other hand, we all know families that don't have two nickels to rub together and they feel infinitely rich because they're building a business, they're building that legacy, mm-hmm. and they know how to generate that wealth. And so one of the core functions of our work is to help these families capture and or recapture that feeling of abundance. And there's really three keys to that we work with. The first is purpose. Very important. That's where we always start. Why are you doing this? What is the role of the company? What are you trying to achieve? Mm-hmm. And why should the family members and the employees and the other stakeholders, why should they care? That's a huge driver. The second is clarity. A lot of times family businesses suffer because family members have multiple hats. You've got your mom or dad hat, you've got your sibling or son or daughter hat, you've got your owner hat, and some of the family members also have an operator hat. And they tend to get those hats mixed up and bring emotion into the meetings, into the business, that may be overreacting to things based on family dynamics. Mm-hmm. And so it's very important to get extremely clear on who does what, who's responsible for what, who owns what, how do decisions get made, etc.
Mm-hmm. And it's also, I think, important that those hats that you were describing, that they're used at the right times and in the right places.
That's right.
You want to have these physical delineations of business is done at the office, business isn't done at the home, and vice versa. It's you've got to have these safe zones.
Yeah, it's geography, but it's also self-awareness. Mm-hmm. It's knowing when you're letting your family, your daughter hat slip into the conversation at a board meeting when it should be your operator hat or your owner hat.
Exactly.
And so they'll, as people get more and more familiar with this idea, that clarity becomes relevant.
Now, one place that I see a lot of people that experience this can relate is when they're working with spouses. Husband and wives starting, running businesses. Sure. They'll get into a point where they're working together and they have to build that healthy relationship of when do they discuss the kids, when do they discuss business, right. Is it at home in the bed, is it at the dinner table, is it at the office? And you do start to learn where those boundaries are and when things are done. And it's when you consciously come to those conclusions that you're able to have healthy relationships.
It's really about self-awareness, and that's why the word clarity is so important.
Yeah.
If you can recognize that. The third essential ingredient is scalability. So many family businesses have been organized. They're historically, mom or dad started a business to just pay the bills, and it just kind of grew. It became successful, and the underlying organization, the foundation, the infrastructure does not allow the company to scale easily. And that's where we're going to actually spend most of our time this morning, is to talk about this concept of scalability, how you can build that into your business, and how you can use it to take your company progressively from one level to the next.
Yep.
We'll touch on family clarity and purpose at the end if we have time, but we'll focus more on scalability.
Exactly.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. Yes.
So first place to start is the difference between what I call just natural random growth and scalability. And really, I think of growth. I'm an old sales guy. I started the first several years of my career was in sales. And I always used to think that growing a business just meant selling harder, being more aggressive, being out there, being responsive to customers. And of course, that's an important element. What I didn't realize until much later is that a company, if it's well structured, if it's well tuned, the natural state of affairs is for it to grow. Because if you're selling something that's worthwhile, if you're providing value to the world, people are going to want it. And if you have the right people in place, you have the right systems, the right processes, we'll get into all that, the company will naturally grow. I call it a natural growth system. And there are many of those. We're all familiar with it. If you take this little baby plant and give it some sunlight, give it some fertilizer and water it once in a while, it's going to grow. It's a natural process. And unless there's a disease or George Washington comes and chops it down, it's going to grow. This little guy right here, he's going to grow. All you need to do is feed him, change his diaper once in a while, and give him some love, and he'll grow. His cells will divide, and he'll move forward. Another example that I love to use is an airplane. This isn't really growth per se, but a well-trimmed, it's called trimmed, a well-trimmed airplane, if you apply power, is going to fly. It's even almost impossible to keep it on the ground. This, by the way, this photograph is from 1984. This was one of my first companies. We built and sold these airplanes. It was called SR-1 Aviation, wonderful little airplane. But the point is that there are systems that are organized and tuned to grow or to fly in this case. And that's the same thing that applies to a well-tuned business. So we think about, what does it take to grow a business? Let's use the example of doubling a company. We do that. That's a part of our vocabulary, is to really talk to business owners and say, let's double your company. How soon do we want to do that? And how do we build the infrastructure to make that happen? Does that make sense?
That's right.
And there's the answer is, instead of thinking outside the box, we say think inside the box. And what we mean by that is that people think about growth in a company, they think of this line that goes up to the right like this, but that's actually a very rare occurrence where a company will grow almost in an analog way, smooth. Really what it is it's more step by step, a series of plateaus and reaching from one operating box, building the next box, filling that box, and then moving into the next box. Almost every company, it's a kind of a digital process versus an analog process. And when you think about that, you think about the elements that are required to facilitate that. We call that the scalabilities, and there's 6 that we focus on. I'll just list them off quickly, and then we'll go in depth on each one. There's first the market attractiveness and fit. What are you selling? Who are you selling it to? how what is the value of that offering, etc. The leadership and culture in the company. These are actually taken in priority order, the business model and finance. So if you don't have a clear product or service that adds value, don't even bother with anything else. And if you do, then you better think about the leadership and the culture of the company, how it's put together, who makes decisions, and then does it make money, and who's going to make things happen besides just the leadership? How well aligned? What is the capacity of those people? What is the physical infrastructure, IT, legal, etc.? And then finally, what are the work processes that support all the other five? Mm-hmm. Those are the dimensions that we look at when we work on scalability. Does that make sense?
It does, because I think what you're doing there is, as you said, these are kind of in a hierarchical order. Once you've kind of addressed one and moved on to the next, you as the owner or the president of the company, you're doing what you're needing to do. This is your role.
Right. And of course, all these happen in parallel every day, and you're constantly trying to fine tune and optimize each one of those 6 dimensions. But when we go in and look at a client company, we start and we do it in that order because it just one leads to the next.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a minute about market attractiveness and fit. Again, just to reiterate, the idea is, to whom are you selling? What are you selling? What is the value of it? Who are you competing against? All these questions. Are you in a growing market that's going to be attractive, or is it a melting ice cube that's getting smaller and smaller over time? You have to understand all of those dimensions. But again, I'll go back to the idea that if you are providing true value and you know who your potential customers are, you know who you're trying to serve, your tribe, if you will, mm-hmm. then you are going to generate demand. Not sure you can fulfill that demand, that's later on, but you're going to generate demand. And I like to use the analogy or the metaphor of a hot summer day in the park. We're here in Salt Lake City, Utah. Let's say you're down at Liberty Park downtown. It's a 95-degree day. Kids are out of school in the summertime. There's 100 kids walking around in this park, and it's very hot, and all of a sudden, the ice cream truck drives up. That's the metaphor I like to use. An ice cream truck, if that, on that day I described, if that happens, they're going to be lined up around the corner. And that's what's going to happen if you're providing value to the right people. You know who those people are, you know where to find them, and hopefully there's growing over time, there's more and more of them. So that's market attractiveness and fit. If we can check that box and say, yes, we've got this in place, then we take a look at the leadership. Who is leading this company? Who's driving things? How does it work? And I like to think of people sometimes, and we think of leaders as individuals like Winston Churchill or Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Teddy Roosevelt. These are singular, strong leaders that happen to be heroes of mine. In fact, our son's middle name is Theodore after Teddy Roosevelt. But it's not just the people at the top. It's also the rest of the culture of the company. I don't know if you recognize who that is.
I do recognize this.
Yeah, there's Steve Jobs on the right and Steve Wozniak kind of tilted sideways in the middle. That's the Apple computer team from back in the early days. But it's really about the leadership team and the leader, her or himself. And they're going to create a culture, and it's either going to be a positive culture that enables scalability, enables people to enroll stakeholders, or it's going to repel people. Does that make sense?
It does.
So let's think about the business model for a minute. There's so many questions. This is where your work really comes into play on the accounting side. But how do we make money? How does it work? What are the unit economics? How much does it cost us to get an average customer? And what's the value of that customer? What are some of the costs that wrap into this beyond the manufacturing or delivery of the product? How are you taking care of inventories? All the details, all the gnarly little things that can hold you up. The bottom line is, does the company make money?
Yeah.
Does it make a little bit of money? Maybe it makes a lot of money. I don't know. That's what we want to do. Figure out, do we have a sustainable business model?
Well, what we're doing here is, at this point, we're trying to then identify the KPIs, the key performance indicators. What are we tracking? What are we looking at that allows the business to communicate back to us its health? and it's going to in a daily, weekly, monthly basis be communicating to us this information.
Absolutely.
And we want to be able to listen and understand to make more intelligent business decisions moving forward.
That's right. This is where the heart and soul of the KPI, the key performance indicators, but actually they drive through each of those 6 scalabilities, and we are tracking those at all times. That's one of the biggest and most fun things that we do, is help build the objectives and the goals, break them down into small component pieces, and then track the metrics going forward. That's the way you have to do it. And that actually leads us right into the team, because these are the people that are going to make it happen. And, we'd like to think that we're going to end up with a bunch of superheroes that can really, take our business forward. But what more often happens is that maybe they're kind of superheroes, but a
little aloof,
but maybe a little, not exactly. And the key here is to ensure 2 things. One is that the people in the company are closely aligned with the culture of the business, with the mission in the business, the purpose. They're here for a reason, not just for a paycheck. And you have to ensure that at all times you have the capacity in your various working groups to grow into that next box.
Yes.
Because as you mentioned earlier, the CEO's job, the leadership team's job, is to be preparing the next box while they're filling up the first box.
Correct. Yes.
In terms of scaling the company. If you let yourself get behind the curve and you overgrow into your current box, it can be very difficult, expensive, sometimes devastating to get out of it. Does that make sense?
Well, I think what you're saying there is very, very key, because as the president, so much of the time needs to be forward thinking, not dealing with the day-to-day operations, but really looking for how and where to build that new box, right?
That's right.
It's creating that next paradigm so that we can bleed into that and grow there.
Right. Well, a wonderful business book, by the way, is called The E-Myth. Michael Gerber wrote that book back in the 80s. And one of the things that he says is that you need to be able to work on your business instead of just in your business. And
right.
That is huge. Wish we had more time to go into this, because this is a very important area. But one thing I'll mention is, this is a little tidbit that we find a lot of family businesses organize their company around the people. So they build their organization chart because Sally's good at this, or Bob is available for that, or Brian can do this, or Mary can do that. And one of the main things that we do is come in and take a look at the company. Scalability depends on how you organize the people, and it should be done by operating position, not by person. Does that make sense? And then you put the people into the boxes. And oftentimes we'll have one person in multiple boxes until the company grows enough to sustain new full-time people. But that's just a very important thing. If your company's organized around the people, then you're not scalable. If it's organized around the positions, then you have a chance of being scalable.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does.
So then we get to the infrastructure. That means, physical. What are the facilities of the business? And what are the legal and compliance, especially if you're in the healthcare industry, a lot of our clients are, or education, accreditation, et cetera. What are the regulatory aspects of this and the legal aspects? And then what are the technology aspects? Of course, a big part of infrastructure is technology. That means also, of course, the hardware and software, but it also means your communications and the way you manage those. And then most important possibly is the way you manage and analyze your data and track that. That's huge. So that's the infrastructure. And obviously you can see how important it is to be constructing that next box after your first box, because if these things impinge on you, then you get really stuck.
A lot of this, the systems behind everything, it's the standard operating procedures, it's the workflow, the processes.
Yeah, you're anticipating the next one. Actually,
that's right.
That's a very big part of it. And the infrastructure piece, we've all had the experience of a little restaurant that we love, and then the line is around the block and it takes an hour to get in, so they decide they're going to open up a much bigger restaurant, and then something changes. Maybe we lose the chemistry. Maybe the quality goes down. It just doesn't feel the same, and it's this transition from the smaller box to the bigger box. I'm just using this as an example. Sometimes it's a crazy box, but the idea is that you have to be very careful to plan those transitions so you don't fall through the cracks.
Well, it's also retaining your identity and being true to yourself. As a company, are you actually continuing with what your customers already associate you with?
And that's why that leadership and culture is so important. That's why it's at the front, and the market attractiveness and fit, because you've got to keep in mind always who you're serving, what are you giving them, and where's the value, and what are the values that you bring to that table.
Yeah.
And then the sixth one is, as you mentioned, these are factories, the small factory, the biggest factory in the world, arguably. But to get to your point is work processes. Mm-hmm. And once you understand what you're selling, to whom you're selling it, then we can optimize the work processes to make it as efficient and effective as we can. So we can avoid having kludgy, complicated systems that don't hold together.
That's the mouse trap.
Yeah, exactly. How to get rid of a mouse. So just to reiterate, the 6 scalabilities: market attractiveness and fit, leadership and culture, et cetera, all the way down through the work processes.
So one of the things that I think is key here is many business owners can relate to all of those, but they, I think, become overwhelmed by it. What's nice is you've broken it down into the 6, and you can more systemically go through each of the things and have them just focus on one part of the business at a time.
Yes, in sequence, and then we clean it up, and then they get that infrastructure in place.
And then you start all over to build the next box.
And then we double it. It's kind of fun. We had this concept called 10xing your company. And when people see that, they think, well, we're going to make the company 10 times bigger. And of course, someday that will happen, but that's not the point. I'm going to explain what that means. You remember we talked about this notion of starting in a smaller box, then moving to the bigger. There's a really fun, I guess it's geometry. There's a fun principle in geometry that if you take a box and you double the size of that box, the volume of the box, which is measured by one side times the next side times the third side, if you double the sides of the box, you're going to actually cube, or 8 times the volume of the box. Mm-hmm. Why is that important? It's kind of just a dumb geometry thing, but it's kind of neat if you think about your business in a certain way, that if you take the business and you look at one dimension of the box as the revenue side, you think of the other side of the box as the profitability side, and the third dimension of the box as the value or customer satisfaction that you're providing. If you double your revenue and just a little bit more than double your profits and enhance your quality, you're going to end up with a 10x in what we call the 10x value of the company. So you're going to take your company and you're going to increase the volume of your box by 10 times. And that's a really neat concept. And it brings it down to a reasonable bite size. Within a few years, you can double the size of your company. And if you can have the discipline to drive, sustain, and improve your profitability, and to drive more and more customer satisfaction, then you're going to end up 10xing your company over and over again. Until if you do that 3 times, then you are literally getting to 10 times the size of the business that you started with. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think what's comforting about that is it's not, you have to 10 times each of those widths or lengths.
Right.
It's not 10 times the revenue, 10 times the profit.
Right.
It's a combination of all of those.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And what you're doing is creating jobs, you're supporting your family, you're creating a legacy, and you're driving value to customers all over the world. It's really it's a neat package. And that's how you sustain a family business for 100 years. A little trick here, that just thinking about doubling your company, is a fun little rule of thumb called the rule of 72, which is if you take the number 72, just works out this way, and divide it by a growth rate, you're going to end up with a number of years that's required to double the size of your company. So in a way, you can almost dial in the growth that you want to shoot for. So if you have 5% annual growth, it'll take you 14 and a half years to double the size of your company.
Yeah.
If you have 25% growth, it'll take you 3 years. And if you have 30% growth, it'll take you 2.5. So you can just do the math yourself, and it's kind of fun to play around with that. We do that a lot with our clients. So we've addressed the idea of scalability. At least we've scratched the surface. I want to briefly touch on the other two keys to family business abundance. And the first one we'll deal with is purpose. And that's the first one we look at when we work with a family. And there are 6 dimensions that we really focus on. We call it the 6 reasons behind the business. And first of all, it's a funny place to start, but we really like to take a step back and look at what is the family grateful for? What do they have today? So often families have resources, assets, strengths, characteristics that are so precious and valuable, and we're also busy in the day-to-day that we don't really take the time to be grateful for it or to acknowledge that it's there. And if you don't acknowledge it, if you're not grateful, then it's not going to serve you. So gratitude is where we start. And then what do you stand for? What are the principles? What are the values that you bring to the family and that you bring to the business because of the family? It's a very interesting thing because of trust and because of these principles. Family businesses that are well run will strongly outperform non-family businesses statistically. Even public companies that have a strong family component, like the Ford Motor Company, the family dynamics will drive that company to higher performance, and especially small and mid-sized companies, because there's so much trust, so much adaptability, able to manage change, that non-family businesses don't enjoy the same benefit. It's very interesting. The third thing we look at is why are you doing this? What is the mission? What is the impact that you're trying to create in the world with your business? And then who's your tribe? Who are you serving? Who's part of your world? Who are you trying to attract? Because a big part of business is knowing who you don't care about, so you can focus on the folks that you do. And then think about your gifts. It's a little bit different than gratitude. The gifts are, what are your strengths? What are you good at? What are your resources that you can bring to the table and that you can build upon? And then finally, what is the legacy that you're looking to have? So if a family, and by extension the business, understands these 6 things, then they're in a much stronger, concentrated position to
I think this is
successful.
A powerful exercise for any business owner or president of a company to go through, because as you go through this, I think it's appropriate to do this from a company perspective and as a personal perspective, and then go through and look at each of your key players.
Oh, yes.
So it's definitely an exercise we're doing. And the thing that I would bring to the table is to suggest that the other key individuals within the organization do it on the other people in the group, because what's key isn't so much your introspective of yourself with this, it's how you're perceiving everyone else.
Right. And that's what you use to build the culture.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing we look at is the clarity areas. How does the family relate? How do the family make decisions? How is it structured? How do they make decisions? How do they share? We have the number 6 here comes up a few times. We have the 6 clarities. The first one is trust. And we'll go in a minute, we'll talk about trust in a little deeper level, but there needs to be the ability to trust, and people need to be trustworthy. And if you understand where someone is coming from, what motivates them, and you can consciously acknowledge and work through that trust, it's huge. The second are the drivers, and they relate to that first one. Is what is the individual purpose, values, priorities, the individually and collectively of the family? How does that purpose fit in? If you can understand that, it provides dramatic clarity to the family. Imagine even your own family, how mushy or squishy those things can be. And the more you dial that in, and I've worked with families that, as I said, big, nationally recognized families, they'll have annual meetings to discuss things like this. They'll have 300-400 people show up in the summer in Maine or something and go through a lot of this and actively and thoughtfully drive through that trust and drivers. They'd be very clear about what are the roles and accountabilities of the various players, so you don't end up with a family member in a position that they don't have the capacity for. The structure of the family, we're not talking about the structure of the business here, we're talking about the structure of the family. A lot of times families will have governance, they'll have a family advisory board, they'll have education programs for the children, they'll have a thoughtful sequence, and you don't have to be a multi-million-dollar family to think about it this way. These these clarities are very valuable for any family. Another one is to be conscious about what you're sharing. One of the things that blows up families more often than anything, believe it or not, is a vacation home. Just little silly sharing assets, sharing relationships, sharing the reputation. The family should consciously think about what they have together. And then finally, they should think about how to manage change, because so many families get stuck in the trap of thinking about how grandpa or grandma did it or how dad or mom did it, and they don't realize that the world is changing out from under them. And today's world, of course, is changing faster than ever, and it's accelerating like crazy. So you have to purposefully think about how the family and the family business is going to handle change.
Yeah, purpose, I think, really plays into this. It's
right.
right there with your driver, and I believe it's one of those things that everyone needs to verbally express, and it needs to be communicated. And when it's communicated, these things start to align because everyone's on the same page.
Right. That's why we pull purpose out into its own key driver, because it's just so important, and it's a good place to start, and it's fun to think about those things.
Yeah.
And then let's talk about trust for a minute. Trust, people often don't dig under the surface of trust. There's actually multiple kinds of trust. I highlight five. First is trusting someone's intentions. Why are you doing what you're doing? And what does that mean for me? Can I trust your intentions, trust your motivations? Do I know you well enough? And the second kind of trust is competency. I can trust your integrity, but I might not, with all due respect, I wouldn't want you to do heart surgery on me or fly my airplane. And so, there's a trust element around the concept of competency. And there's a trust element around the concept of care. Do you genuinely care for me as a person, or do you care about other things? And in fact, that leads to the next two. One is transparency. Do I have full knowledge of where you're coming from, what drives you, where you are relative to these things, or are you holding things back? And then the final kind of, and the weakest kind of trust is the kind of trust that most of us rely on in business most of the time, and that's the concept of alignment of interest. And I put that last because it's not last but most, it's last but least, because you can start out well aligned with a business partner, with an employee, with a colleague, and over time, your interests and your alignment will likely diverge. And that's where the other 3 or 4 types of trust come into play. And if you don't have those other types of trust, then that's when you end up in a legal problem or disappointed in one way or the other. So it's just very important to establish this kind of trust. And that's one of the advantages that family businesses have over non-family businesses, because this trust tends to run deeper in these families.
Very well said.
So that's our conversation today about family business abundance. I really appreciate this.
Oh, happy to. This was wonderful. So one of the things, Brad, that you mentioned as we were preparing for this is that you have a list of books that you oftentimes recommend or suggest business owners read and have as part of their library. And as part of this, I believe you mentioned that you'd like to do something with that.
Oh, sure. I'm a big reader. I read all the time, and there's millions of business books out there. And a lot of them are not any good, but a lot of them are wonderful. And I've got a list of several in each of the scalability areas that have really helped me over the years and have helped our clients. And I'm glad if somebody's interested in that, please email me at that email address there, and I'll be glad to send that to you. Also, feel free to reach out with a phone call or with an email, and I'd be glad to have a no-cost introductory conversation. If you've got a challenge, if you're feeling stuck, if you've got a question about any of these things, I'd be delighted to meet you and speak for a few minutes.
And as part of the conversation, one of the things that we're going to be doing is we're going to be providing here with this webinar a link to get a free copy of the ebook. It's actually called In the Black: 9 Principles to Make Your Business Profitable. So it's essentially
one of the books on my list.
There you go. So it's a perfect book for you to take advantage of and get your free copy today. So with all of that in mind, Brad, thank you for coming. I love this. I think it's a phenomenal conversation that business owners need to be having. It addresses not only their personal things, the business things, but definitely the family element. So this was a wonderful conversation. I trust you got the most out of it. But thank you for your time sharing this.
Thank you, Roger. I enjoyed it.
All right. Much. Take care, enjoy, and just remember this. If it's about business, it's universal. Take care.
Bye-bye.